You know that voice, the one that starts whispering just when you're about to try something new. It doesn't shout, it's too clever for that. It nudges, it questions. Are you sure you're ready? You didn't really think you could pull that off, did you? It pretends to be cautious, pragmatic, even responsible. It wears the mask of realism, but its currency is self-doubt. That's the inner critic, and it lives in all of us. What makes the inner critic so insidious is that it often sounds like truth. Not drama, not fantasy, but cold, rational truth. It doesn't yell, "You're worthless." It whispers, "You could have done better." It's just subtle enough that you might believe it. And for many of us, we do, so often in fact, that the voice becomes automatic, indistinguishable from our actual thoughts. This is where we begin. Because before we can silence or even soften the inner critic, we must learn to recognize it, not just as a thought, but as a pattern, as a part of the psyche that has a function, a history, and a strategy. It is not your truth. It is a construct, and like any construct, it can be observed, questioned, and eventually transformed. One of the challenges in identifying this voice is that it doesn't always come across as hostile. Sometimes it masquerades as discipline. It tells you you're being lazy when you rest. It tells you you're falling behind when you set boundaries. It speaks in the language of urgency, performance, and comparison. And because we live in a culture that rewards productivity over presence, perfection over process, the critic often feels justified, necessary even. But here's the key distinction. The inner critic doesn't want you to grow. It wants you to comply. Its goal is not evolution, but protection, psychological safety at any cost, and the cost is high: creativity, spontaneity, joy, and connection. The critic is deeply invested in certainty, in avoiding risk, in staying within the boundaries of the known. And so it punishes curiosity, it punishes ambition, it punishes authenticity. This is not to say the inner critic is evil or malicious. It's not. In fact, it was likely formed as a defense mechanism, a way to navigate early life where approval, safety, and belonging were conditional. Perhaps you learned that love came through achievement, or that making mistakes was dangerous, or that being too visible, too emotional, too much would lead to rejection. The critic emerged as a kind of internal parent, an internal authority figure, trying to keep you safe by keeping you small. And so the voice developed. Over time, it became habitual, unquestioned, like background noise. And yet it shapes so much of how we relate to ourselves, our self-worth, our confidence, our ability to take risks, to be seen, to tolerate failure. The inner critic is not just a voice, it is an entire internal posture, one that leans away from vulnerability and toward control. To recognize the critic is not just to label it, it is to witness it in action. To start noticing when a thought about yourself carries the energy of shame, fear, or contempt. To ask, whose voice is this? Who taught me to speak to myself this way? Would I say this to someone I love? These questions disrupt the automaticity of self-judgment. They reintroduce consciousness into the conversation. You can't change what you don't name. And so the practice begins with naming. This is the critic speaking. Not to fight it, not to suppress it, but to create enough distance from it that you can choose how you respond. Because the moment you recognize that this voice is a part of you, rather than the whole of you, you regain agency. Once we start to recognize the inner critic's voice, the natural next question is, where did it come from? Because this voice didn't emerge from nowhere. It's not random, and it's not just yours. It's a psychological inheritance, a composite of voices we've absorbed, internalized, and mistaken for our own. For most of us, the inner critic begins forming in childhood, not necessarily through explicit harm, but through the subtle, repeated signals about who we needed to be in order to belong. Maybe it was the look of disappointment on a parent's face when you cried too loudly, or the pressure to perform, to achieve, to be exceptional in order to be noticed. Maybe it was the silence after failure, the lack of comfort, or the way praise was conditional, always tied to doing, never simply to being. Children are meaning-making machines. They don't just receive experiences, they interpret them, and often those interpretations become unconscious beliefs. I'm only lovable when I'm useful. I'm not safe if I make mistakes. I have to be perfect or I'll be rejected. These beliefs don't stay at the surface. They take root, they evolve, and eventually they become a part of the internal world, an inner narrator that sounds eerily like us, but is often just a patchwork of other people's fears and expectations. Culturally, the story gets even more layered. Many societies equate worth with productivity, identity with performance, and morality with control. So it's no surprise that the inner critic often echoes cultural ideals. Be thinner, be richer, be more accomplished, more disciplined, more palatable. These aren't personal failings. They are reflections of the systems we live in. But internalized long enough, they feel personal. They feel like truth. And yet, there's something profoundly liberating about realizing the critic is not innate, it's learned. And if it's learned, it can be unlearned, or at the very least, it can be related to differently. We begin to see that the critic isn't actually trying to harm us, it's trying to protect us. It was built in response to real needs, safety, love, acceptance. It just never evolved with us. It's still operating from an outdated script. This shift from judgment to understanding is critical because when we meet the critic with curiosity instead of contempt, we disarm it. We move from shame to compassion, from defensiveness to insight. And insight is what allows us to rewrite the story, not by erasing the past, but by reclaiming the authorship of our present. We cannot change the fact that the inner critic was born from our environment, our relationships, and our culture, but we can decide how much authority we give it going forward. When we talk about the inner critic, we often focus on the noise it makes, what it says, how it says it. But we must also look at what it does, because the critic isn't just a voice. It's a force that shapes our internal environment, influences our behavior, and quietly defines the limits of our lives. At its core, the inner critic distorts our relationship with ourselves. It doesn't just point out mistakes, it turns those mistakes into identities. You failed becomes you are a failure. It takes moments and turns them into narratives. And over time, those narratives become lenses, ways of seeing ourselves that are narrow, harsh, and unforgiving. The emotional impact is often invisible but deeply felt. Chronic self-criticism erodes our sense of self-worth. It breeds anxiety, not only because we fear failing, but because we fear what we'll say to ourselves when we do. It fuels perfectionism, not the pursuit of excellence, but the terror of inadequacy. We begin to believe that anything less than flawless is unworthy, not just the work, but we are unworthy. And here's the irony. The more we criticize ourselves, the less resilient we become. Self-criticism doesn't prepare us for challenge. It weakens us against it. It creates a loop. We avoid risk to avoid failure, then shame ourselves for playing small. We crave connection but self-reject before others get the chance. The critic promises to keep us safe, but in reality it keeps us stuck on the edges of our potential, of our relationships, and of our joy. It also affects how we relate to others. When we live under the constant gaze of our own internal judge, it becomes harder to be present. We compare, we compete, we shrink. We project our own inner judgments onto the people around us. we become less trusting, less generous, less able to receive love, because deep down we don't believe we deserve it. The critic asserts that it's helping, that without it we'll lose control. But what it actually does is disconnect us from our creativity, our intuition, our playfulness. These are the very qualities that make life meaningful, and they don't flourish in the presence of fear. They require space, permission, compassion. The good news is that even a little awareness goes a long way. When we start noticing the emotional residue of the critic, tension, shame, hesitation, we create the possibility for change, not through force, but through kindness, through the quiet decision to speak to ourselves differently, to build a relationship with ourselves that is more honest, but also more humane,